Hello once again. We're back for the second movement in Johannes Brahms' First Symphony, published I think in 1874, at the very least in the mid-1870s, after working on it for 20 years. And this is performed by the Berlin Philharmonic and conducted by Herbert von Karajan. And the second movement is Andante sostenuto. Now, after the first movement, I had to check online just to remember what sostenuto means, and it's a playing direction, not for tempo, but for playing style, and it's to smoothly, continuously connect the notes and chords such that they flow into each other. In that way, I think it's essentially the opposite of marcato, which is to play them very individually and distinctly. So yes, Andante, moderately slow, and sostenuto, meaning smoothly and continuously. So that is the direction that Brahms gave to this movement. Let's give it a listen. This is Johannes Brahms' First Symphony, the second movement, Andante sostenuto, and it's performed by the Berlin Philharmonic and conducted by Herbert von Karajan. Beautiful. And I have to say, I'm having quite an experience listening to this because it's in this middle range. And what I mean by that is, a lot of classical pieces, I've heard them many, many times. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony would be a great example. The Emperor Concerto by Beethoven. Some of Dvorak's works. Dvorak, is that what I said? Yes, but the point is, there are several works that I've heard so many times that I love them and I know every single moment of them. And then there's the experience of listening to something you've never heard before, which is exciting in a different way, in that you really don't know what's coming and you're surprised by things. This is in between. I've heard this symphony a number of times, and parts of the first and fourth movement more than the rest of it, precisely because it is used to great effect in Notame, and I think it's performed a couple times over the course of the show. But I have not heard it anywhere near as many times as some of those pieces I mentioned, but I have heard it before. So it has that quality of being familiar, but still with moments that don't come back until I hear them, still with some ability to surprise me or at least remind me when I was not thinking of a passage in advance. So yes, it has a very, what's the right word, intermediate place in my classical music knowledge. I'm familiar with it, but not overly. So I'm really enjoying this listening, is what I mean to say. And the second movement, and again the next movement as well, I'm not as familiar with as the opening and closing movements. So yeah, that was a particularly enjoyable experience. And you could really hear the sostenuto direction with lots of parts and melodies flowing into each other, where they just, it's like the melodic strokes are holding hands, the different parts of the orchestra are blending together into a tapestry. It really did have that sound. And yes, a beautiful movement. I think Brahms is a very expressive composer, in particular in his string writing, and I love that moment. I mean, there were a few moments that it did this, but it was maybe in the final third of the movement where the full string section is providing these graceful sweeping melodies, and then a solo violin rises up high above it with a very elegant melodic line. So I particularly enjoyed that part. We'll be back for the next movement, which is quite short. I think the third movement, I don't remember this recording specifically, but I think it's like 4 to 5 minutes long. So in the grand scheme of symphony movements, and maybe this symphony particularly, the last movement of which is like 18 minutes long, so brace yourself. But yes, the next movement is quite short, so I will see you in a moment for that. Peace.